morning, Mr. Mybeck.
Good morning, Chairperson.
Yes. I understand that there has been miscommunication about what time we start. We're supposed to start at 10, but looks like one of my staff members sent wrong information. So we are going to adjourn and start at 11. That will then give also your team and Mr. Singh's team a chance to discuss any issues that may need to be discussed, so that when we start at 11, we can just go on.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. We'll then adjourn until 11. We adjourn. Good morning again, Mr. Mybeck. Good morning,
morning, DCJ.
everybody.
Morning.
Good morning,
Chairperson.
good morning. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you, DCJ.
Okay, let's start.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
Morning, sir. Morning, Chair.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
I would like just to go back to the issue of your travel. When you went to Eskom, did you continue making these personal stroke private trips to Dubai?
If I recall correctly, yes.
Can I ask you,
Sorry, Chairperson, I can't hear you.
You can't hear your client or everybody?
I can't hear my
Your
learned
client.
friend,
Okay, all
Chairperson.
right.
And I also need to hear him, it's very important.
Yes.
all right, well, let me repeat the question then, if I may, DCJ.
Yes.
I'd asked you whether after you went to Eskom, you continued with your personal stroke private trips to Dubai, and I understand you answered yes.
That is correct.
Could I ask you please to go to bundle 5B, exhibit BB23, and could you turn to page 829, in fact, to 828.
I'm there, sir.
Are you there?
Yes.
Now, this is a judgment of the High Court in the matter between Eskom, McKinsey and Trillion, etc., where Eskom sought to overturn payments made to Trillion. I just want to take you to a few paragraphs of this judgment insofar as it relates to you. Could you please go to paragraph 16 at page 835?
I'm there.
At the foot of page 835, paragraph 16 reads, once Mr. Malefe and Anoj Singh arrived at Eskom, senior officials at Eskom who were expected to act in good faith and in the best interests of Eskom started to interact with Mr. Essa, meeting him at his offices in Melrose Arch, Johannesburg, feeding him with confidential information belonging to Eskom. Some of these officials, in particular Mr. Michela Koko and Mr. Anoj Singh, enjoyed trips to Dubai, either paid for or facilitated by Mr. Essa through the Gupta-linked businesses. That these events occurred with the sole intention of favouring or benefiting Trillion, if not fraudulent, is quite obvious. And then if I could ask you to go to paragraph 56.
Chairperson, wouldn't it be convenient if Mr. Singh answers the various points put to him by my learned friend? Otherwise, it becomes a very long statement, and we might have to repeat it.
Well, Mr. Mybeck might be needing to refer him to Mr. Singh to another paragraph before he puts the question he wants to put. What paragraph?
I want to take you to paragraph 56 at page 868. And it just continues the theme. Obviously, Mr. Singh, I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer or to raise whatever you want to. At 56, corruption is the only issue that Trillion seems, even though feebly, to put in issue. Upon examination of the undisputed facts, it seems that even on this aspect, Trillion fails to make out a case. One of the events that stand out in the corrupt collaboration between Trillion and Eskom officials was the all expenses paid trips enjoyed by Eskom officials Koko and Anoj Singh to Dubai, which were arranged by Mr. Issa and Sahara, a Gupta-owned company. Want to comment on those two paragraphs?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think if we refer to this entire...
So you need to speak into the
sorry,
mic.
Yes,
Sorry.
Bring the mic closer to you.
Mr. Chair, if we refer to the entire, how can I say, matter between Eskom and McKinsey and Trillian, Mr. You'll note that I was not cited as a party to this application. So for me to comment on these matters would be inappropriate, but to the extent that Mr. Myberg requires me to comment on paragraph 16. Just 1 second, I've lost it now. And to the extent that we've dealt with these matters yesterday, Mr. Chair, if you look at paragraph 16, Mr. Say, it says, senior Eskom officials who were expected investigators started interacting with Mr. Essa, meeting him at his office at Melrose Arch, feeding him with confidential information belonging to Eskom. Some of these officials in particular, okay, so let's deal with the first part, Mr. Chair. Firstly, Mr. Chair, I deny that I met Mr. Essa at his Melrose offices. There's no evidence to suggest that Mr. Essa and I met at his Melrose Arch offices while he was a shareholder of Trillian. Secondly, Mr. Chair, in terms of feeding confidential information about Eskom, again, Mr. Chair, I deny that I fed any confidential information to Mr. Essa because, again, there is no proof to support that. In terms of the trips, Mr. Chair, I think we've dealt with that yesterday, and I've denied the involvement of Mr. Essa or the Gupta-linked entities relating to these trips that is mentioned in paragraph 16. If we then go to paragraph 56, Mr. Chair, we deal again with the issue of the corrupt collaboration between Trillian and Eskom officials, Mr. Chair. Again, Mr. Chair, I deny any allegation of corruption against me. I've dealt with the issue of Trillian extensively in the Eskom stream. And again, Mr. Chair, in terms of the trips, I deny any association with Mr. Essa or Sahara group of companies relating to these trips, as we've dealt with yesterday.
All right. And then if I can take...
Sorry, Mr. Myberg. Do we by any chance have a set of the court papers relating to this statement? You know?
I'm sure we can obtain them,
Yes.
DCJ.
I would like to see this set.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Mr. Singh, after this application had been launched, which resulted in this judgment, did you become aware of the fact that an application had been lodged at the High Court by Eskom against Trillian, among others? Did you become aware of the application pending in the High Court before the judgment?
Mr. Chair, at the time I don't recall, but I would think through the media I did become aware.
Yes, yes. Nobody sent you the papers or anything?
No, sir.
Okay, okay.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 57, Trillian claims that even assuming the correctness of these allegations, they do not assist Eskom. In essence, the allegations concerning Messrs. Koko and Singh do not demonstrate a causal nexus between their alleged receipt of gratification and the conclusion of any agreement with McKinsey or the appointment of McKinsey or indeed Trillian as subcontractor. What Trillian states in this excerpt is far removed from the truth, as the following facts demonstrate. You go over the page. As Chief Financial Officer, Singh was a signatory to the Board Tender Committee submission on 8 August 2016, which motivated the 1.8 billion settlement inclusive of payment to Triple B partner which partner is not identified. 2, Trillian sent invoices directly to Singh as what appeared to be Trillian's contact person at Eskom. 3, the Board Tender Committee's December 2016 resolution appointed Singh, Koko and Mabalani to negotiate, Mabalani, I beg your pardon, to negotiate the final settlement, which included payments to the EEE partner. 4, on 6 July 2015, Koko was tasked to conduct negotiations as Group Executive, Technology and Commercial, to conduct negotiations of the MSA. 5, Koko and Singh sought approval of the 2015 McKinsey contract from the Eskom board. Evidently, there is a consistent pattern in the behavior of these senior officials, which at the end of the day benefited Trillian. Another theme in the conduct of these officials was that whenever invoices landed at Eskom's desk, they were settled with alacrity and with a total and unseemingly disregard for Eskom's internal prescripts regarding payment approvals. The objective evidence presented by Eskom demonstrates that just a nexus between Eskom and Trillian's benefaction, but speaks to a theme of consistently corrupt behavior. Perhaps I should just read the last sentence again. The objective evidence presented by Eskom demonstrates more than just a nexus between Eskom and Trillian's benefaction, but speaks to a theme of consistently corrupt behavior. You want to comment upon that?
Mr. Chair, again, in terms of the objective evidence that's presented by Eskom, demonstrates. Sorry, sir.
I think you must put your file on top, because when you speak looking down.
Let me do this.
Yeah, when you speak looking down, we can't hear you properly. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Chair, in terms of, let's start with probably the last sentence. In terms of the objective evidence presented by Eskom, Mr. Chair, again, I reiterate, I was not party to this application. So I'm not privy to the evidence that was actually presented by Eskom to demonstrate the issue of that speaks to the theme of consistently corrupt behavior. On whose part? I'm assuming, I don't know on whose party. Mr. Chair, if we look at the paragraph 57.1, 57.2, 57.3, 57.4, and 57.5, and we'll take them in turn. Mr. Chair, if we can start with 57.5, it says Koko and Singh sought approval of the 2015 McKinsey contract from the Eskom board. Mr. Chair, as we've discussed in the Eskom stream, dates become very important in these type of matters. And I don't recall having arrived on the 1st of August 2015, where I sought approval for the McKinsey contract. If I recall, the McKinsey contract the confinement to McKinsey was approved in July 2015, if I recall correctly. That was prior to my arrival. So that is as it relates to 57.5. And here again, on 57.4, Mr. Chair, which confirms, on 6 July, Koko was tasked with to conduct negotiations as the Group Executive Technology and Commercial, to conduct negotiations on the MSA, which again suggests that it predated my arrival of 1 August. If we look at the Board Tender Committee in December, Mr. Chair, I think that was, I don't think there's a dispute in terms of the 57.3. Mr. Chair, I don't know what level of detail you want me to go into relating to these matters, because obviously this is not an Eskom stream. But for me for you to fully appreciate the comment in terms of the Board Tender Committee's 2016 resolution appointed Singh, Koko and Mabalani to negotiate the settlement agreement, I'd have to go in a little amount of detail for you to appreciate the context behind this resolution.
I think it's important that within the context of Mr. Mybeck's question, that you give me enough that you think gives you a fair opportunity, to deal with the question.
Mr. Chair, can we do?
Obviously, there is the ESCOM work stream.
I was just going to suggest that.
Yes, but I don't want a situation where the question might require you to deal a little more fully with the issue and you don't deal more fully with it to your own detriment. So,
well, Mr. Chair, I think
like
maybe
you to be able to say, this is the thrust of my answer, or this is my answer.
I think, Mr. Chair, with the understanding that we're still going to traverse these issues on the ESCOM stream, I will provide you with the context and the background behind the 57.3 to the extent I think it's necessary here, with the understanding that we'll more fully cover it.
Well, because Mr. Mybeck is the evidence leader, subject to what he says, because he might be wanting a full answer on certain matters, he might be wanting not so detailed an answer on certain questions. Mr. Mybeck, what's your input?
Chairperson, I have no difficulty with Mr. Singh providing whatever explanation he wishes to give at this time.
Yeah, okay, all right. So,
thank you, Mr.
Yeah, so satisfy yourself that you have given a fair, you have given an answer that reasonably satisfies you that you have answered the question.
Okay. Yeah. So let's come back to 57 things. So we've dealt with 57.5, we've dealt with 57.4. Mr. Chair, 57.2, Trillian sent invoices directly to Singh as what appeared to be Trillian's contact person at ESCOM. Mr. Chair, 57.2, as I recall, in terms of the evidence that we presented on the ESCOM stream, Mr. Chair, if memory serves me correctly, the only invoice that was actually sent to me directly was the invoice for the corporate plan that related to the 30 million payment. I do not recall if any of the MSA invoices were actually sent to me. And Mr. Chair, again, the issue of Singh appears to be Trillian's contact person at ESCOM. I think we've explained and traversed again in the ESCOM stream. Any connotation as it relates to me being Trillian's contact person in a, I'm going to say, unsavory manner, I think we reject. Because we've explained that the invoice relating to the corporate plan was sent to me directly because I was the recipient of those services. And as I said, Mr. Chair, again, this is from memory. In terms of the 57.1, Singh was the secretary to the board tender committee submissions on 8th August, which motivated for 1.8 billion settlement, inclusive of the BEE partner, which was not identified. Mr. Chair, factually, that is not disputed. I did sign the memo, I did recommend the memo. And Mr. Chair, the recommendation of the memo was on the basis that the board tender committee held the mandate to either approve or disapprove. I did not hold the mandate, because you will recall that prior to the 8th of August 2016, I think sometime in June 2016, the board tender committee had already taken a resolution to terminate the board, the master services agreement with McKinsey and its subcontract. And that resolution empowered a settlement process to be engaged upon. Following the 28th of June letter from McKinsey, let's call it letter of demand. So, Mr. Chair, again, in context, I did not approve a 1.8 billion rand settlement. The document was prepared based on a request from the board tender committee that emanated in June, vis-a-vis the settlement and the termination.
Was this submission of the 8th August 2016, you did not recommend the approval?
Mr. Chair, it was a recommendation for them to consider the settlement.
Yeah.
So, yes.
But it motivated for the approval.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the actual approval actually sat with the board tender committee themselves.
I think the To the extent that you want to make the distinction at a factual level that you did not approve,
Yes.
even though you may have
Recommend.
been in support of
Yes.
approval, is a fair point.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Chair, in terms of, so then going back to 57.3, Mr. Chair, because I'm trying to deal with it in chronological order. The Board Tender Committee in December 2016 resolution appointed Singh, Koko and Mablani to negotiate a final settlement which included the payments to the BE partner. Mr. Chair, subsequent to the approval of the 8th of August of 1.8, the Board Tender Committee, I think at that point, approved the payment of 800 million of the 1.8. But there was still a settlement process that was still ongoing, because the eventual amount that was actually settled on was an amount of 1.6.
Was an amount of?
1.6 billion.
Yeah.
And the settlement agreement, Mr. Chair, was ultimately signed between Eskom and McKinsey in February 2017. So that is the context behind the December 2016 resolution of the Board Tender Committee. In this ongoing negotiation process, they then requested that myself, Mr. Koko, and Mr. Mablani engage with McKinsey to find a lower value than the 1.8 that they'd originally approved. And at that time, Mr. Chair, I think this coincided with the independent review that had been done by Oliver Wyman. And that was the basis for, let's ask for a lower amount. Okay. Mr. Chair, again, in terms of this, the resolution appointed us to do this. We engaged with them, we engaged with McKinsey. When I say we, I think it was primarily Mr. Garma and Mr. Mablani that used then the Oliver Wyman report to arrive at a settlement value of 1.6 billion, which was then, I think, taken to the Board Tender Committee in February, and then was settled upon approval by the Board Tender Committee, which then resulted in Mr. Mablani signing the final settlement agreement with McKinsey, which then affected the last payment of 1.6. Mr. Chair, if we then go on to the point of, evidently there's consistent pattern of behavior of these senior officials that at the end of the day benefit Trillion. Mr. Chair, I deny any benefit, any favoritism that I had showed towards Trillion or McKinsey for that matter. As I understand it, Mr. Chair, the negotiations that were undertaken between Mr. Mablani and Mr. Govender in terms of the settlement process was actually done with McKinsey. Another theme of conduct of these officials was that whenever invoices landed at the Eskom desk, they were settled with clarity and with a total and unseemly disregard for Eskom's internal prescripts regarding payment approval. Mr. Chair, again, on the Eskom stream, we went into a level of detail, and we've also provided in our supplementary affidavits to the Commission the roles and responsibilities of who approves payments, how payments are approved, who the officials are that actually checks invoices and the like.
I'm sorry, has that document been provided? Because remember, in the Eskom stream, I think I did mention that Mr. Seleka and his team to try and obtain a document that sets those things out at Eskom.
Mr. Chair, just for
Like
clarity.
operating procedures or policies,
Yes.
yeah.
So we, if you recall, Mr. Chair, I think it was on the last day that we came for the Eskom stream previously, where we put up a supplementary affidavit, and it was relatively voluminous.
Yeah. Oh, well.
And we wanted to start with that, and then it was decided that, listen, we will continue with Mr. Seleka's,
Yes.
and we will come back
Oh,
to,
I
so
think
that, so those things are in that bundle.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so we will certainly come back to that. Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I haven't seen them, I think.
So the Commission hasn't actually seen them,
Yeah,
but the
okay.
documentation is
Is there.
in the possession of the.
Okay, all right.
as part of one of our supplementary affidavits.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, again, if we look at the wording of this, it says the conduct of these officials. Now, I can only assume that they're referring to myself and Mr. Koko. Mr. Chair, these invoices that they refer to on the MSA that was approved and paid, I certainly did not play any role in the manner in which they were in the manner in which they were processed in the system for them to be paid. And again, there is no evidence to suggest that I was the one that engaged in the payment of these invoices. I think, Mr. Chair, that's all I would like to say in terms of this paragraph.
Okay, all right.
Excuse me, thank you. Before I go further into the judgment, could I ask you just to go back, please, to page 856. There the judge quotes from an extract from Eskom's affidavit 47.2. Eskom expands on the corrupt link between Trillian Essa and the Gupta family when it says, quote, as I've mentioned, Mr. Essa was the majority shareholder and a director of Trillian Capital Partners. I attach Mr. Essa's biography, as well as relevant extracts from a PIPC director search as Annexure PH 14 and PH 15. Mr. Essa is widely known to be a close associate of the Gupta family. Annexure PH 15 reflects Mr. Essa's role as a director of VR Laser, another company with close links to the Gupta family. Mr. Koko has also admitted that he attended private meetings with Mr. Essa regarding Trillian's work at Eskom. In this regard, I attach relevant extracts of Mr. Koko's testimony in Parliament as Annexure PH 16. Do you have any comment on that?
Mr. Chair, none of these issues in this paragraph 47.2 are within my personal knowledge.
Are you suggesting that you didn't know that Mr. Essa was a shareholder and director of Trillian?
Mr. Chair, when I think I've testified to this on the Eskom stream, Mr. Chair, not until McKinsey had given us the termination letter relating to their relationship with McKinsey, or Trillian.
So you came to learn, whose termination letter?
There was a process that of vetting that Trillian was undertaking, or McKinsey was undertaking on Trillian.
All right. So you only came to learn of this right at the end?
That's good.
Did you not have any dealings with Mr. Essa in relation to Trillian?
No, sir.
I see. And then let's go to the conclusion. Paragraph 67 at page 875. In the present matter where the probabilities are apparent.
Sorry, so what page is it?
875, paragraph 67.
875.
875. I think you appear to be in it. Are you in the right file?
No, yes, sir. Okay. It's the same one, no?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I'm there, sir.
Paragraph 67. In the present matter where the probabilities are apparent that senior officials of Eskom would leave no stone unturned to benefit Trillian, where confidential information belonging to Eskom was leaked to Trillian, where senior personnel of Eskom who were expected to display the conduct of the utmost good faith and to act in the best interest of Eskom, where there appears to be a corrupt relationship between Eskom's senior personnel and the directors of Trillian, justice and equity demand nothing less than that the monies paid to Trillian unjustifiably be returned to Eskom. Any comment on that?
Mr. Chair, again, if we look at the paragraph in turn, Mr. Chair, I don't know who the officials that they refer to in terms of leaving no stone unturned to benefit Trillian. I deny that was me, Mr. Chair. if anything, as I've explained to you before, Mr. Chair, the entire process relating to the settlement, Mr. Chair, was relating to negotiations with McKinsey themselves. Where confidential information belonging to Eskom was leaked to Trillion, Mr. Chair, again, I deny that was me in any way, shape, or form. Where senior personnel of Eskom were expected to display the conduct of utmost good faith and act in the best interest of Eskom, Mr. Chair, I think at all relevant times, I conducted myself in that regard. When the issues relating to the MSA became apparent, as I testified in terms of the reasons for the termination of the MSA, Mr. Chair, that was acting in the best interest of Eskom. When that termination decision was made by the steerco, Mr. Chair, I requested that legal and the procurement department get engaged to ensure that the termination process is handled in a manner that is in compliance with or identify risks associated with the termination process, then mitigate them appropriately. Mr. Chair, in terms of the negotiation or final negotiation, Mr. Chair, we did obtain a final independent assessment that was conducted by Oliver Wyman, which indicated a certain value, which was negotiated with McKinsey and was settled. Again, Mr. Chair, acting in the interest of Eskom. Lastly, Mr. Chair, at all relevant times, Mr. Chair, I was given to understand that a legal review and legal processes or legal review of this McKinsey contract was being undertaken, and there were no issues relating to the settlement. And again, Mr. Chair, just from a perspective of the sake of clarity, again, the legal assessment and legal aspects relating to this falls outside the purview of the Office of the CFO.
And then if we go finally to the order, starts at paragraph 70 at page 876. I just want to direct your attention to page 878, following on the paragraph that I've read. There were two orders that I just want to put to you or ask you, bring to your attention. 70.6, the payments made by Eskom to Trillion arising from the impugned decisions above are declared unlawful and invalid. And 70.7, Trillion is ordered to repay to Eskom the sum of 595,228,913 rand and 29 cents, together with interest thereon at the prescribed rate, calculated from the date of judgment to date of payment. I don't suppose you have anything to say. If you want to comment on that?
No, sorry, I don't have any comment.
So, Mr. Singh, as I read paragraph 67 of this judgment, you were found, in effect, to have been in a corrupt relationship with Mr. Essa.
Sorry, so which page again you on?
67.
867.
Yes, 875, paragraph 67. When you read that paragraph in context of the judgment, in effect, you were found to have been in a corrupt relationship with Mr. Essa.
867.
Yes.
Page 875, paragraph 67.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, as I've explained previously, one of the other paragraphs, Mr. Chair, I deny the fact that I had a corrupt relationship with Mr. Essa.
Yes, but what I'm putting to you is my interpretation of that paragraph is you were found to have been in a corrupt relationship with Mr. Essa, because the directors of Trillion referred to are Essa, and the senior officials of Eskom that are referred to are you and Mr. Koko.
Well, Mr. Chair, then the finding of the court obviously occurred without my input, because I was not cited as a party to this application.
So you accept that interpretation of the paragraph, but you say that finding was made without your input.
That is correct.
Okay.
All right. Now, whilst on the issue of Mr. excuse me, Mr. Essa, you will recall that on the first occasion that you gave evidence, I took you to parts of Mr. Bester's affidavit. We're still going to come back to that.
That is correct.
And he said that he met with you and Mr. Essa at Melrose Arch at a restaurant there in approximately April 2014. And you, as I recall, you denied that. Correct?
That is correct, sir.
And as I understand it, your evidence before the Commission, and you must correct me if I'm wrong, is that you only ever met Mr. Essa twice.
That is correct.
And you met him in the context of him wanting to meet you to explore potential business opportunities, and I'm talking about Transnet. You say that those meetings might have happened at Melrose Arch, but that was the sum total of your meetings with Mr. Essa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as I understand it, you now, in evidence, contend that both whilst you were at Transnet and Eskom, you've said when you were at Eskom, you had no meetings with Mr. Essa.
That is correct.
So your testimony before the Commission is you've met this man only twice,
That is correct.
informally outside of Transnet.
That is correct.
So that then brings me to something that I didn't ask you last time, and that is the testimony of Mr. Garma. Now, you've been provided with the relevant extract of his affidavit.
May I interrupt you, Mr. Mayberg? Please don't forget your question, because I don't want to forget getting this clarification from Mr. Singh. I don't know whether this would have fallen under the Transnet. It may have fallen under the Transnet work stream. Did you deny having been part of or having attended the meeting that Mr. Hank Bester testified about, where he said, if I recall correctly, you were there, Mr. Salim Essa was there, and he was there. I think he testified about 2 meetings which he had, which involved Mr. Essa. But I think in one of them, he said you were there, but most of the time it was Mr. Salim Essa was doing the talking. But I think in the other one, he didn't include you. Did you deny having been part of any meeting in which Mr. Salim Essa was present, as well as Mr. Hank Bester?
Mr. Chair, I think, if for context, I think Mr. Mayberg at that time had started leading this evidence relating to this meeting. And I think we then got into the first bit of the details of the meeting,
Yes.
which I then denied being present at that meeting.
Yes.
And then I got into the reasons as to why the meeting was potentially, how can I call it, as to why I deny the meeting ever happened. And I think at that point in time, we then adjourned for the day.
Yeah.
So I think we never completely traversed the reasons
Yes.
as to why I had my denial, but I did deny.
Okay, all
Yes,
right.
the meeting.
Okay, all right.
Yes. Well,
It
perhaps,
just occurred to me, and I was wondering whether when he says he met Mr. Salim Essa twice, whether that could be one of the 2 times, and that's why I wanted to double check.
yes, it wasn't, you're right, you denied this. And perhaps just to refresh everyone's memory, you have, you could please go to Transnet Bundle 4, Exhibit BB19.
Give me 1 second.
Do you need some assistance, Mr. Singh, there?
Please, if someone.
Yeah, okay,
Someone will
somebody
help you.
come and assist you.
Sorry, we are at?
I think it's the files, bro.
Sorry, sir, you are at?
So you need to go to a tab that says BB19.
Yeah.
And then if you could turn to page 45 of BB19. This is Mr. Esther's, I beg your pardon, affidavit. And this is the meeting that the DCJ was asking you about. I just want to reflect on it. Upon my arrival at Melrose Arch, as I walked towards the restaurant, I was met by a gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Salim Essa. He said that he was there to meet with us as part of the discussion with Singh and needed to see if the restaurant is clean. I asked him where Singh was, and he said that he will call him when he, Essa, is ready. I asked Essa whether he himself works for Transnet, and he responded that he's doing a lot of things, or something to the effect that I have a lot of businesses. He clearly had no intention of answering my question in detail. I was surprised at the time that as soon as Essa called Singh, Singh arrived a few minutes later. This is the meeting that you deny, is that so?
That is correct.
So you stand then by your testimony that you only ever met Mr. Essa twice in the circumstances that I've described and you've confirmed.
That is correct. So just a point of clarification, Mr. Chair, do you, or Mr. Myberg, do you want us to go into the detail as to why this meeting is denied? Because we didn't really finish it last time.
I think that you've already dealt with that, but it is my intention to come back to MMP to finish off that later. Now,
Okay, in that event, we must just make sure that he gets the chance to substantiate his
all right,
denial.
well,
Yeah.
Mr. Singh, perhaps you could just deal with that now. So it's
Yeah,
not
maybe, yeah, to
Yeah,
give your
I think for
reasons
the
why
sake of
you-
completeness, Mr. Chair, we can.
Yes.
Because this is obviously one of the more contentious issues in Mr. Bester's affidavit. Mr. Chair, as I started the last time in terms of providing feedback and context in terms of this meeting, Mr. Chair, as I said, I deny this meeting. And I was going into the details as to why I deny this meeting. And it has its nexus in the paragraphs that precede that. And I think it's paragraph 54 and 55, if I recall, Mr. Chair. It's been some time in terms of being able to have dealt with these matters. But I think the issue is, and I've dealt with this in the affidavit, in my responding affidavit, Mr. Chair. If you look at paragraph 55, now if you recall, Mr. Chair, the nexus of this entire process was a company called DEC and Mr. Reddy, and how DEC and Mr. Reddy was trying to use their influences to engage with Mr. Bester's company to be able to become a subcontractor to them. And I think Mr. Bester had testified to the fact that it was, they were unscrupulous or underhanded mechanics that were happening at the time. So notwithstanding that testimony that Mr. Bester had given prior to that, Mr. Chair, he still seeks out Mr. Reddy to engage with myself to purportedly resolve some unpaid invoices in terms of the project that they had undertaken at the time. And Mr. Chair, at that time, Hatch was involved in, if I recall correctly, the new multi-product pipeline project. And this is a pipeline project. And Mr. Bester is obviously from the rail division of Hatch. So, Mr. Chair, in that vein, again, I'm not understanding how Mr. Bester gets involved in in pipeline-related invoices when he's a director of rail in the Hatch environment. But anyway, He then goes on to say that at the time, Craig Sumpton, CFO of Infrastructure Division of Hatch, now the CFO of Hatch Africa, sent numerous emails to Singh requesting a meeting to discuss the outstanding invoices without success. Mr. Chair, again, he does not attach any of these emails. I don't have any recollection of these emails in terms of a request for discussions from Mr. Sumpton. Reddy told me that it was possible for him to arrange the meeting as he had very close relationships with Singh and that he will arrange the meeting. Pursuant to my request to Reddy, he called me and told me that Singh would meet us, but outside Transnet offices at a restaurant in Melrose Arch. The meeting was confirmed, and Craig Simmer from Hatch's Infrastructure Division and Sumpton accompanied me to the meeting. Mr. Chair, again, what is peculiar about this meeting is that Mr. Bester does not attach any of these invites to Mr. Simmer or to Mr. Sumpton. Yet, if you recall previously, he had a very good record of actually providing us meeting requests previously in his testimony. Neither does he supply us with the confirmatory affidavits of Sumpton or Simmer in terms of that. And again, Mr. Chair, peculiarly, the date of the meeting, neither Simmer nor Sumpton arrive. So it's...
Just repeat that, please.
I said, curiously, on the date of the meeting, neither Sumpton nor Simmer arrive at the meeting. So it's just Bester himself that arrives to purportedly meet with the CFO of Transnet to discuss invoices that are outstanding on which he has no background. So if it was a legitimate meeting where he was prepared to come and discuss these invoices, Mr. Chair, he was going to discuss invoices of which he had no understanding or background. And I'm saying, Mr. Chair, it's highly irregular for a person, well, in an organization such as Hatch, to engage with the CFO or group CFO of an organization like Transnet and send individuals that actually have no background in terms of the topic that is going to be discussed. Secondly, Mr. Chair, what is curious is that upon my arrival at Melrose Arch, which is paragraph 57, Mr. Chair, on page 045, I walked towards the restaurant. I was met by a gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Esser. Now again, Mr. Chair, I'm not too sure how either Mr. Bester or Mr. Esser recognizes each other. Because at this time, Mr. Reddy is not there, neither am I there, but they recognize each other somehow. And then obviously the discussion...
Well, it's clear from that sentence that Mr. Bester, at least it seems to me, is meeting somebody that he didn't know before. I get the impression that Mr. Esser, on Mr. Bester's version, walked to him and introduced himself. Obviously, he could only do that if he thought he was the person he expected to meet there.
But that's the point, Mr. Chair.
If he had been told how he looks like or something like that.
And that is what I'm saying. Mr. Chair, if I was approached by someone that I didn't know, I would probably ask, how do you know who I am? Type thing, which Mr. Bester fails to explain. And Mr. Chair, lastly, in terms of these issues, I deny, as I said, I deny I was at this meeting. I also deny the fact that Mr. Esser called me. And I arrived... You
deny that, Mr. Esser?
That Mr. Esser called, because it says here in the last sentence of paragraph 57, I was surprised at the time that as soon as Esser called Singh arrived a few minutes later. I have not received any calls from Mr. Esser.
Yes. Well, in paragraph 58, he says that the meeting centered around payments from Transnet to Hatch for work that had been performed on the NMPP, and Hatch was supposed to have been paid within 45 days after submitting invoices to Transnet. But he says the meeting was superficial because you did not offer any insight into the reasons for the late payments or systems of communication that could potentially improve the payments. He says he thought you were probably disappointed with the meeting. He had a distinct impression that you had hoped that discussions were going to center around Hedge working with Freddie and his group rather than to resolve Hedge's issues of outstanding payments. He says throughout the meeting, he got the impression that ESA was the boss and you were his subordinate.
Mr. Chair, I deny the entire contents of this paragraph.
Yes.
Because
Did you know Mr. Hedge at all while you were at Transnet?
Sorry,
No, Mr. Bester. Did you know Mr. Bester at all when you were at Transnet?
No, Mr. Chair. To the best of my recollection, I don't think I met him.
Yes. So, but you.
Other than
This.
let me qualify that.
Yeah.
Because later on in his affidavit, he does mention, I can't recall if it's later on or it's already preceded, Mr. Chair, but he does mention that there was a meeting that happened at Transnet offices.
Which you were supposed to attend according to him.
That was an earlier
you kept
meeting.
on walking up and down
Yes,
the passage.
but that was an earlier meeting.
Oh, that's an
And
earlier
I think
one.
there is another one that comes later on,
Yeah.
where I think I did attend that meeting, and Mr. Bester was part of that.
Yes.
So if anything, Mr. Chair, I would have probably met him at that meeting.
Yes. Okay.
And I think then there was there was a cocktail function or something thereafter.
Yeah.
And maybe he was there and maybe I met him there. So, but prior to that, Mr. Chair, I would find it difficult to understand when I would have engaged with Mr. Bester.
But as I understand it, and you must tell me if I misunderstand you, on your version, Mr. Bester just fabricated this whole idea of this meeting, that he had a meeting with you and Mr. Salim Essa.
Well, Mr. Chair, on the available facts, it's clearly a fabrication.
And why do you think he would want to falsely and deliberately put you in a meeting that you did not attend?
Mr. Chair, the motives for these things, I would not know.
Yeah, but the two of you have never had any issue.
No, Mr.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Maida?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I could just take you to a few other paragraphs, because there was another meeting that Mr. Bester had with Mr. Essa, and that you see at paragraph 59 at page 46. Soon after this meeting, I received a call, but perhaps before I lose my train of thought, can I ask you this? Do I understand you now to say, or perhaps I could put it differently, did you ever receive telephone calls or make telephone calls to Mr. Essa whilst you were at Transnet?
No, sir.
Not a single one?
No, sir, not that I recall.
Even around the two meetings that you had?
Which two meetings? Yes.
The two meetings that you've told us about?
Yes, sir.
You did have telephone calls around those meetings?
No, sir.
So you placed not a single call to Mr. Essa in your time at Transnet, and he placed not a single call to you?
Not to my recollection.
Let me put this proposition, going back to my question to you about this meeting. What would you say to the proposition, a proposition along this line, that on your own version, Mr. Bester had no reason to fabricate a story like this against you, but maybe you might have a reason to deny that such a meeting took place, even if it did take place, because it might associate you with Mr. Salve Esther, who has lots of allegations of corruption against him. What would you say to such a proposition?
Mr. Chair, I think, again, I wouldn't want to speculate. Right? So the proposition that you put, I wouldn't want to look at it in the term of speculation.
Okay.
I would rather take you back to what I would believe as to be the objective facts
Yeah.
relating to Mr. Bester.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if you look at...
And those are the ones you have articulated.
No, I will
Or
articulate
you want
further.
to add? Okay.
So if you look at the entire submission of Mr. Mr. Bester engages in this, first he engages with the issue of Reddy and DEC, and then engages with Ms. Stradom and gentleman's name? Stradom and Basson.
Yes.
Right. In the issues relating to DEC and a subcontract. Now, Stradom, Basson, and Bester are fully aware that they're not supposed to be doing it, yet they continue doing it. Okay? He then comes to a point where he concludes that Reddy is a less than honorable gentleman, on his version. He nonetheless then still seeks out Reddy's help to resolve this alleged impasse relating to the invoices that he wants resolved. And coincidentally, then there's a meeting with ESSA that's happened. Notwithstanding the fact that he then has this, let's say, meeting interaction with ESSA, I think then Mr. Myberg was going to lead to the next meeting with Mr. Bester and Mr. ESSA that excluded me. Again, I'm not too sure whether it was arranged by Reddy or not, but again, he still accedes to the meeting with Mr. ESSA. Again, Mr. Chair, you then move on. Now you have the extension to the first tender that was issued. Now you have MEP 2, let's call it. And again, Mr. Chair, there's an issue of subcontractors that comes up. Right? We still maintain that we require a high level of empowerment in the tender. They understand that that is a requirement, and they basically know that they need to comply with it. Again, ostensibly because of the history of, let's call it, phase 1. They then still, Mr. Chair, notwithstanding the fact that they've already understood the issues with DEC, understood the potential relationship that DEC may have with Mr. ESSA, understanding the issues that Mr. ESSA allegedly has of his own, they had hatched themselves, sit down and have a meeting as to whether they can then accept DEC as a subcontractor on phase 2 and eventually accept accept DEC as a subcontractor. Now, Mr. Chair, when you take all of this into account, it would probably seem to me a more plausible outcome for Mr. Bester to be explaining why Hatch was engaging in this behavior rather than me denying a meeting with Mr. ESSA.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Myberg?
Yes, thank you. Just incidentally, the affidavit does read that Mr. Simmer and Sumton accompanied Mr. Bester to this meeting. That you see at paragraph 56.
Oh, that is correct, sir. Sorry, yes.
Yeah. And in fact, Mr. Bester testified to that. So, Mr. Singh, what we do know is
But
that...
it doesn't detract from the fact that we don't have confirmatory affidavits from either one of them.
Fair enough. What we do know, Mr. Singh, that this is a very important allegation made against you.
That is correct, sir.
You didn't apply to cross-examine Mr. Bester.
That is correct, sir.
In fact, you haven't applied to cross-examine anyone.
That is correct.
I see. Now, let's go to the next meeting that Mr. Essa had with Mr. Bester at paragraph 59. Soon after this meeting at page 46, I received a call from Reddy informing me that Essa requested a follow-up meeting with me in Melrose Arch. I informed Graham Sutton of the call and a meeting date was set. Unfortunately, I can't remember the date of the meeting. The meeting was held at JB's Corner in Melrose Arch, and in attendance was Essa, Reddy, and me. Let me take you to paragraph 61. It was a bizarre meeting. It appeared to me that Essa was a regular in the restaurant as everyone seemed to recognize him. Essa arrived carrying several cell phones with him, and during the meeting he received numerous calls which interrupted our conversation as he continuously walked out to take calls. I became very annoyed with this behavior. Paragraph 62, Essa told me that Hatch must include his company, in brackets whose name he didn't mention at the time, in our phase 2 tender submission. I told him that we had already finalized our group, including our SD partners, and that there was no way of now including his company in the submission. Paragraph 63. He insisted that we should include his company and said that they have a lot of power. Having regard to my previous encounters, I understood they to be Essa and Singh, but I could also have included other individuals within and outside Transnet. It could also. Essa mentioned that they, in brackets, Essa and Singh, will increase the contract value after award and that we should include about 80 million. I can't remember the exact value, but it was an enormous figure as an initial value. He further indicated that the 80 million will increase to something ridiculous in the order of 350 million or beyond. He said that the contract value in brackets for phase 2 will eventually increase to over 2 billion. If I remember correctly at the time, our submission for rail was valued at approximately 800 million. Now, what I want to ask you is, are you able to dispute, do you have any knowledge of this second meeting that Bester held with Essa?
No, sir, no.
And do you see here that Mr. Essa was really trying to muscle in on Hatch, wasn't he, as a SD partner?
It would appear so.
For what it's worth, I just mentioned that when Mr. Bester makes the allegation that Mr. Essa said the contract value would eventually increase to over 2 billion rand. It's difficult to read that without thinking about the trains which where the value increased drastically. So that crosses my mind. That's all I'm saying.
Well, Mr. Chair, maybe I should put your mind at ease, Mr. Chair. The contract was never awarded for 2 billion.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking, I'm not giving any figures, but I know there are transactions where the values increased in a manner that's very unusual. Yes, Mr. Maybeck?
Yes, thank you. Then, perhaps whilst we're on this affidavit, let me take you to paragraph 75, because you're correct, Mr. Singh, you did, there was a time when you met Mr. Bester, and there is reference in this affidavit to, I think it is a cocktail party, that you find at page 51, paragraph 75.
Maybe before you say, you proceed, Mr. Maybeck, Mr. Singh, you see, if this meeting, which you accept you know nothing about,
Yes.
take place, the challenge with your version is that Mr. Bester says, in effect, it was a follow-up on the previous meeting, which you say is a fabrication.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. So I'm just mentioning that there is that challenge.
Mr. Chair, I don't see the challenge, Mr. Chair.
Well, the challenge is this. If Mr. Bester is correct that this was a follow-up meeting, then there must have been an earlier meeting. And the earlier meeting would only be the one he's talking about.
Mr.
But
Chair,
if you say if it was not a follow-up, it was a standalone meeting, that's different.
well, Mr. Chair, I think let's put the earlier meeting into context. When I say I deny the meeting, I deny that I attended the meeting. I would not be in a position to deny that the meeting actually happened between Mr.
Yes.
Mr. Bester and Mr. Esa.
So you deny that you were part of the meeting?
Part of the meeting on the
but-
basis,
Yes.
on the basis of what I've suggested.
You don't deny that there may have been a meeting
Mr. Chair, I
involving
wouldn't-
them without you?
I wouldn't, yes, I wouldn't be able to do that.
Okay, all right. But then if that was the case, then Mr. Bester must really have been singling you out to just falsely put you in that meeting in a very strange way, because a meeting took place and he would have known who were in that meeting, but he brings you in knowing that you were not in that meeting. That would be the implication.
Well, Mr. Chair, I think in my last response to your proposition,
Yeah.
I outlined possibility as to why
Yeah.
Mr. Bester is
Yeah.
taking the approach that he's taking,
Yeah.
in order to motivate why they actually ended up taking DEC as hedge, as a subcontractor, where they patently knew that it was problematic, or there were alleged issues with DEC and the alleged relationship, if it existed, with Mr. Esa and Mr. Esa himself, in terms of the allegations against Mr. Esa.
Yes. Okay. Mr. Mabecker?
Yes, thank you. And at paragraph 75, on page 51, after negotiations, but before the project kicked off in early 2015, the senior people of the H2N JV were invited to a meeting with Singh and Peter in the Carlton Centre. In attendance on behalf of the H2N JV were me, Ali Naidu, CEO of Mott MacDonald, and Dempsey Naidu, CEO of Mott MacDonald, COO. Let me read that again. In attendance on behalf of the H2N JV were me, Ali Naidu, COO of Mott MacDonald, and Mr. Dempsey Naidu, CEO of Mott MacDonald, and an executive of Oricon. At this meeting, Singh told us that we were very lucky to have been awarded this contract, and he will watch us very closely. All our directors viewed Singh's comments as very negative and could not understand why he was against our appointment. It may have been because we didn't include SA in our bid. After this meeting, the H2N JV hosted a small celebratory function and invited senior representatives of Transnet such as Singh, Peter and Sakasana, and Mr. Mohammed Mohammadi. During his speech, Singh made negative comments about the H2N JV and criticized our team before the project had even commenced. You want to comment on that?
Mr. Chair, yes. In my affidavit, Mr. Chair, I go to some extent in terms of trying to outline the context behind this meeting. If I take you back to the testimony I led before the Commission, Mr. Chair, you will remember that I tried to...
I'm sorry, are you talking about an affidavit where you are responding to Mr. Bester's affidavit that we're looking at now?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Is it in this file, Mr.?
Yes, I'll find it whilst Mr. Singh is
Okay, all right.
addressing it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, continue.
Mr. Chair, let me take you back to when we actually started the MEP Phase 1. MEP is Manganese Expansion Project, which is this entire affidavit of Mr. Bester. I did say, Mr. Chair, at that time, it was a relatively large project. I think it was probably one of the top 5 projects in terms of by size in the capital expenditure program of 300 billion, which I introduced yesterday. Mr. Chair, a project of this size and magnitude does and will carry an inordinate amount of risk and execution risk relating to from time of inception to time of completion. And Mr. Chair, one of the reasons that we, as Transnet at the time, were focusing particularly on, let's call it capital expenditure and capital expenditure risks, was because of the sheer size of the capital expenditure program was 300 billion. As I explained yesterday, Mr. Chair, the MDS was a counter-cyclical investment strategy. So it means you were actually investing against the demand, which increased the risk quite significantly for the organization. So you needed to have a handle on risks, a real handle on risks. So given the fact that we had history, Mr. Chair, of overruns on previous locomotive purchases, on the NMPP itself, the Durban dugout port, the Transnet entrance wide, sorry, not Durban dugout port, Mr. Chair. I think the project was called the Durban Entrance Harbour Widening Project. And given the fact that we're now embarking on this 300 billion rand program, one of the stakeholders that were particularly keen on understanding how we were going to manage the program from a risk perspective was the credit rating agency. The next stakeholders that would be interested in understanding how we were going to manage this significant risk was potential investors that were going to fund Transnet. Now, we needed to demonstrate firstly that we had learned, or we've learned our lessons from the past and what we were going to do differently in the future. That would be one way to demonstrate through rating agencies as well as potential investors that, okay, we know what we're doing. And one of the biggest issues that we encountered on the NMPP project, or the new multi-product pipeline project, Mr. Chair, and I think I cover it in one of my affidavits, that the project actually increased from, I think it was 9 billion to, I think currently it's sitting at about 30 billion, if I'm not mistaken, or 35 billion in terms of completion, is that the EPCM contractor is vital. And the manner in which you engage the EPCM contractor, the way you engage with the EPCM contractor, the manner in which you manage the EPCM contractor is critical to one, successful implementation of the project. And when we say successful implementation of the project, we are talking project on time, within budget, and within schedule. Now, the reason why EPCM contractors are so critical, Mr. Chair, is because they become an extension of the organization. So Transnet does not, or Eskom does not have the personnel to actually sit on the project on a day-to-day basis to manage it. So we actually outsource that through what we call the EPCM project, or the EPCM consultant. Now, Hatch, Mr. Chair, was one of those consultants. So we're basically taking an MEP project, we're handing it over to Hatch, and we're saying, Hatch, implement this project on our behalf, and you have a budget of whatever it is, let's say 10 billion. So basically, we're handing 10 billion over to Hatch. Right? So the context of this meeting, Mr. Chair, was, in my view, there was nothing untoward about this meeting. This meeting was basically a meeting to say, guys, we've dealt with EPCM contractors in the past, we've burnt our fingers significantly, and we have a live example in the NMP. We want to do things differently on this project. We want this project to be a success, and we want it to be on time, within budget and schedule. And that is what your actual function is. And that was the context behind this meeting. There was nothing untoward about it. This meeting was, as I said, set up to outline Transnet's expectations vis-a-vis our EPCM contractor that was appointed. Also, Mr. Chair, just to highlight, in terms of, to provide context in terms of the award, Hatch could have been awarded, any other company could have been awarded, Mr. Chair. And this comment of whoever was awarded would have had the same meeting, because the underlying basis for the meeting was to outline our expectation. So even if it was any other, if it was Oricon that was appointed, they would have also been said, you were lucky to get this, because our expectation is not to service us as you serviced us in the past. It is completely different. And Mr. Chair, I actually played no role in awarding this. So whether it was Hatch, whether it was Oricon, whether it was any of the other engineering companies that was awarded this, it was a product of the process. And the evaluation process is conducted by the evaluation team. So, Mr. Chair, that's the context behind this meeting. And as I said, it was really a meeting where we really wanted to outline what Transnet's expectations of our EPCM service providers was going forward.
Okay.
Well, that's the context, but did you say these things? That they were lucky to have been awarded the contract? And were you critical of them?
Mr. Chair, I don't think I was critical of them. I think that's the reason why I spent an enormous amount of time explaining the context for the meeting. And the context for the meeting was to outline our expectations.
Yes. Well, did you say these things? Did you say they were very lucky?
No.
ECJ, you asked for the reference to the affidavit. You will recall that Mr. Singh has filed a series of affidavits, 5 different affidavits. He deals with Mr. Henk Bester in his first affidavit, and that you find in bundle 5B at page 445. I don't intend to take you through it. I'm just simply bringing to the attention of the DCJ from paragraphs 42
I'm
onwards.
sorry, just repeat the page.
Page 445 through to page 451.
Okay.
And these are things that we had gone through, Mr. Singh, before. I'm not going to retraverse that. What I'd like to do then is to take you to Mr. Garma's evidence, if I may. If I could ask you, please, to pull out Exhibit BB 28.
Okay, I have found it, Mr. Mybeck. I just wanted to know where it is because I might have to
Thank you.
read it again. Okay, all right. We go back to...
We're now in a different exhibit, Exhibit BB 28, Mr. Garma's exhibit.
In which bundle?
It's in a different
a
file.
different
Your
one, yeah.
registrar will give it to you.
Oh, okay.
And could you please turn up page 48? Are you there?
Sorry, what page, sir?
Page 48.
I'm there, sir.
Paragraph 31.3. In or during July/August 2015, says Mr. Garma, I needed to discuss a work-related issue with Anoj Singh, the then Chief Financial Officer of Transnet. Singh's office was in close proximity to mine, and I walked to his office and observed him, in brackets, through a clear glass partition, in a boardroom together with Singh. I entered the office...
Together with ESA.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, together with ESA. I entered the office and had a very brief discussion with Singh. And as I left, ESA indicated to me that he was desirous of having a meeting with me. Without giving much thought to the request, I responded that he could obtain my contact details from Singh. You want to comment on that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have no recollection of this said meeting with Mr. Essa, and neither do I recall Mr. Garma ever meeting Mr. Essa in my office. Mr. Chair, you would have regard for the date being July, August 2015. If it was August 2015, Mr. Chair, I can tell you the meeting never happened because I was at ESCOM at the time. Then that only leaves July 2015. Mr. Chair, in terms of July 2015, if the meeting did happen and on Mr. Garma's version, Mr. Chair, my office is constructed in such a way that my office is, let's say, here, and then there's an atrium, and my PA sits in the atrium, and then there are two additional individuals that sit in an office that's adjoined to the atrium. So you have my office here, you have the atrium, and then there's two additional offices, but they're all part of one office. Okay. So, Mr. Chair, if this meeting did indeed happen, it would be very easy for either Ms. Takane, who was my PA at the time, to confirm whether Mr. Essa was indeed in my office, or Mr. Yusuf Mohammed, who would be sitting in that additional office, or Mr. Norman Mabaso, who also occupied that office, to confirm that this meeting actually happened, which I categorically deny.
Just so that I understand your evidence, when you say you have no knowledge or recollection, you're not saying you can't remember. You're saying this didn't happen. You categorically deny that it happened.
That is correct.
So Mr. Garma also just gets it all wrong.
Well, Mr. Chair, respectfully, I think when Mr. Garma comes, he can explain. But
he
he's already come.
Yes,
But,
he has already come.
yes. But in my view, Mr. Chair, I am telling you this meeting did not happen.
Yes, Mr. Maibek. Continue.
No, so you also didn't apply to cross-examine Mr. Garma.
No, sir.
So you say that he's also just fabricating the story of having seen you having a meeting with Mr. Essa in your office.
That is correct, sir.
And are you able to offer any reason why Mr. Garma would want to falsely implicate you in a meeting with Mr. Salim Essa in your office?
No, I have no reason, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
So at this time, Mr. Garma was the acting GCE of Transnet,
That is correct.
and you were his CFO.
That is correct.
Now, Mr. Garma's version or evidence about the fact that Mr. Essa said, "I'm desirous of meeting with you," and without giving much thought, as he said, he responded and said he could obtain my contact details from Singh. That you knew to be Mr. Essa's modus operandi, didn't you? I mean, he was desirous of meeting you. He sought you out, and he had meetings with you, right?
With two, yes. 1 or 2, yes.
So that's how Mr. Essa operated.
I wouldn't know, sir.
No, but I'm asking you, isn't that exactly what he did in relation to you?
As
He
it
knew,
relates to me.
just if you bear with me, he knew you to be a high-ranking official at Transnet. Seems he sought you out. He sought to make contact with you and meet with you. He did that, didn't he?
That is correct.
And he then does the same with Mr. Garma. Because, of course, now Mr. Garma is a very high-ranking official. He's acting as the GCE of Transnet, correct?
Well, I would hesitate to say that Mr. Garma was a high-ranking official of Transnet for a very long time, other than when he was a GCE. He was also the chief executive of Transnet Freight Rail for a very long time.
But this is Mr. S's modus operandi, isn't it? To try and make contact, close contact with high-ranking officials.
Chairperson, I wanted, I left my learned friend to pursue this point, but I really have to object at this point in time. When you put a proposal like this to a witness, you must have a factual basis on which you put the proposal.
Just tell me what proposition?
That this is his modus operandi. The way that my learned friend is putting it to Mr. Singh is asking him to comment on a factual statement that my learned friend is making, and I'm submitting to you there's no basis for him making such a factual statement. Unless he can direct me to where in the bundles he's got it under oath, and I will then ask forgiveness for having missed it.
Mr. Maibek?
The factual basis is what happened with Mr. Singh. And I thought I'd made that clear. Perhaps I can retraverse that ground. Mr. Singh,
Yes, sir.
it's your own evidence, as I understand. You must correct me if I'm wrong, that you had 2 meetings with Mr. Essa. He contacted you. Your evidence is not that you contacted him. So on 2 occasions when you were Chief Financial Officer, he makes contact with you. He asks for meetings with you. And during those meetings, he, I think you said, explored potential business opportunities. So I'm simply putting to you that Mr. Garma's version of what Mr. Essa said to him accords with your interaction with Mr. Essa.
Chairperson, I again object. That's not so. Look at what is stated by Mr. Garma.
Well, Ms. van den Heever, I'm going to add to what Mr. Mybeck says about Mr. SalimEssa's modus operandi. I'm going to add something that's not in the Transnet work stream, because I happen to hear evidence relating to different work streams. It is something that happened in the Transnet work stream. Mr. Essa,
Chairperson, I just missed.
Mr. Essa sought out the CEO of Transnet, Mr. Saluji, and called him to a meeting at the Gupta House, and on the evidence that has been led here, sought to have Mr. Saluji agree to some businesses involving the NEL and entities that Mr. Salim Essa was connected with.
Thank you, Chairperson. Of course, we have no knowledge of that. So
Yes,
my
okay.
objection was
Yes.
based on a proposal that was
Yes.
put that was nowhere to be found in our bundles.
Yes, no, that's fine. Okay. Okay.
Perhaps I could just fast forward. What then happened, I don't assume you can dispute this, is that Mr. Essa then did invite Mr. Garma to a meeting. Can you dispute that?
Mr. Chair, I have no knowledge of this said meeting.
Mr. Garma's version is that that invite arose from the interaction in your office.
Mr. Chair, I've testified to the fact that this meeting in my office never happened.
Well, actually, now that Mr. Mybeck has asked that question, I wanted to say to you, when I asked you a question about whether you were saying Mr. Garma was fabricating all of this about this meeting, I was under the wrong impression that he saw you sitting with Mr. Salim Essa on his version while he was passing. But I see that he actually says he did enter your office.
Yes, sir.
Which means he had a proper opportunity to see who you were with on his version.
That is
So
correct, sir.
as opposed to maybe just passing and seeing inside your office through a window or glass or something. So he says he did enter, so which means that it's unlikely he would be mistaken about if he saw you with somebody that might not have been Salim Essa if he was just passing and saw through a window. But here he says he entered, so if his version is true, he had enough opportunity to see who the person was that you were having a meeting with. But I understand that you say no such meeting took place. I just wanted to clarify because earlier on I was under the impression that he didn't enter your office. But it's clear from his version that he says he did enter. But you say nothing of that sort happened.
No, sir. Well, sorry, I'm saying yes, nothing of that sort happened.
Okay. Mr. Mybeck.
Yes, and then going back to the invitation, Mr. Essa does invite him to a meeting. You've probably seen this. Mr. Garma gets the address, and as things turn out, it's the Saxonwell compound of the Guptas. And a meeting takes place there. I don't suppose you can dispute
Mr. Chair, I have no personal knowledge of this meeting. I'm not sure how I can dispute it.
Please just repeat your answer.
I said I have no personal knowledge of this meeting. So Mr. Myberg wants me to dispute this meeting.
No.
I'm saying I have no
He
personal
doesn't want you to dispute. He wants you to dispute. He wants you to comment and say whether that's true or it's not true or what you have to say about it.
Well, from where I sit, Mr. Chair, it's not true because the meeting that Mr. Garma alleges to have happened in my office did not happen. So this meeting that he alleges that preceded the meeting in my office could not have happened.
All right.
So,
And Mr. Chair, it's interesting to note that at paragraph 31.2, which is on page 047, Mr. Garma actually had his first interaction with Mr. Essa at a regiment's meeting.
yes.
I'm going to come to that.
So, Mr. Singh, I don't know if you pick up what I pick up here. The meeting that Mr. Garma, on his version, subsequently had with Mr. Essa either in October or November, which it deals with at paragraph 31.4, is a follow-up on the discussion that he says Mr. Salim Essa had on the day that he had a meeting with you in your office, that is Mr. Salim Essa, and Mr. Garma says he entered your office and spoke to you briefly, and as he was leaving, Mr. Salim Essa followed him and asked and said he would like to have a meeting with him. So this is a follow-up meeting arising out of that. So we spoke earlier on about a follow-up meeting that Mr. Henk Vester talked about with Mr. Salim Essa, having had on his version a meeting with Mr. Salim Essa and yourself. So you say you can't dispute that this October/November meeting of Mr. Garma and Salim Essa took place, but you say definitely the meeting that he talks about, that is Mr. Garma in your office with Mr. Salim Essa, did not take place.
Mr. Chair, let me put it to you this way. Mr. Garma, I think you are correct, Mr. Chair, in terms of summary, that I deny the meeting that took place in October or November emanated from the meeting that took place in my office. And as I said, to confirm whether this meeting in my office took place or not is very easy. It's a matter of speaking to three individuals. Okay? In terms of the follow-up meeting, Mr. Chair, again, it is convenient for Mr. Garma to say he's met with the Gupta family and he's met with Mr. Essa, and conveniently implicate me in terms of the person that introduced him to Mr. Essa.
No, he doesn't say that. He says he had met Mr. Salim Essa earlier, prior to him seeing you with him in your office, paragraph 31.2.3. He had met him, it was about approximately 10 people. I think it was at regiments. So he doesn't have to say you introduce him to Salim Essa. He had met Salim Essa before.
No, I agree, Mr. Chair. I see that, Mr. Chair. And hence I'm saying, Mr. Chair, it is convenient, as you are pointing out previously, to say Mr. Bester alleges that he had a meeting with you and then there's a follow-up meeting. Mr. Garma has a meeting where Mr. Salim Essa is present and then he has a follow-up meeting. Right? And I'm saying, and this is what I was trying to get to, is that it is very convenient for individuals like Mr. Bester and Mr. Garma to, after the event, associate my relationship with Mr. Essa on the basis of trying to cover up stuff that they have to account for.
I'm not sure.
You're not suggesting that Mr. Pester and Mr. Garma came together and put up stories that
No,
at
Mr.
meetings
Chair.
that-
No, I'm not suggesting that, Mr. What I'm suggesting is, if you look at the case of Mr. Bester, I outlined to you the reason why Mr. Bester would be taking the approach that he's taking to explain the reason why he puts me at a meeting that I was not at.
Well, you said what you said, but one of the things you did was you conceded that, if I recall correctly, that he would not have had a motive to falsely implicate you in
No,
anything.
Mr. Chair. But beyond that, Mr. Chair, I then went on to say that if you look at the reason why Mr. Bester may have put me at that meeting, is to conveniently explain the reason why Hatch then actually ended up being a subcontractor to DEC.
Yes.
Right? And again, Mr.
And
Chair,
with Mr. Garma?
and again, Mr. Chair, Mr. Garma ends up, or admits, going to the Saxonwell residence. And conveniently, it's as a result of meeting with me at my office.
Well, it doesn't link it to meeting you or meeting Mr. Salim Essa at your office. But anyway, Mr. Maybeck?
Why do you say he conveniently links it to you?
What is the convenience?
Well, Mr. Chair, as I understand what Mr. Mayberg and what you are trying to ascertain is this meeting that happened in October flows from the meeting that happened in July, August. So what you are trying to say is that this meeting, well, what Mr. Garma is trying to say is that had this meeting in July not happened, then the 15 October-November meeting would not have happened. And I'm saying it is convenient that you meet someone in my office in July, and automatically in October, then a meeting happens that you then attend in Saxon.
Well, I'm not sure that I understand the convenience part, but I think we must proceed, Mr. Mayberg.
Thank you. So I wanted then to take you to the first time that Mr. Garma met Mr. Essa. This is at paragraph 31.2. You've referred to this at page 47. He says that in and during 2015, I attended a meeting with representatives of Regiment's Capital Pty Limited at Transnet's offices. The meeting was attended by a number of Transnet officials, executives, and senior consultants representing regiments, as well as consultants from McKinsey and Company. Next subparagraph. Since I knew all of the McKinsey consultants, I assumed that the remainder of the persons in attendance represented regiments. Next subparagraph. One of these persons was introduced to me as Salim Essa. I recall that approximately 10 persons attended the meeting. Regiments was a service provider to Transnet, advising it on certain transactions that we considered entering into. Are you able to deny this or dispute this? That Mr. Essa was present at your office at this meeting?
Sorry, at my office.
Transnet's offices during 2015.
So I think Mr. Garma will have to define which is Transnet's office.
He did in his evidence. He said the Carlton Centre.
Okay, that's 50 floors.
I'm asking you, are you able to dispute this?
This is not within my knowledge. I cannot dispute. I deny that from my recollection. I don't recall Mr. Essa ever being in Transnet office.
So that's what I wanted to put to you. I mean, on this version, Mr. Essa came to the offices at the Carlton Centre. Was it unusual? You say you never saw him.
I've never seen Mr. Essa at the Carlton Centre. I think just for the record, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
And this is not to create an acrimonious relationship with the Commission.
Yeah.
I'd just like to place on record that we did receive a 3-3 notice. for Mr. Garma.
I'm sorry, just repeat
I
that.
said I just want to place on record that we did receive a 3-3 notice for Mr. Garma. But that was a redacted version of the 3-3, and it only contained paragraph 31.3.
It did not contain this particular paragraph.
We had to request
Yeah,
the full affidavit of Mr. Garma, which was then provided.
yes. Oh,
And
okay.
that comes to the point of Mr. Myberg in terms of us wanting to cross-examine.
Yes,
Whether we would have or did not, that's beside the point.
yeah,
The point is, I would like to place on record that at our request, then only were we provided with the full affidavit of Mr. Garma.
yeah. Mr. Maybeck?
Yes, thank you. And do you feel that you have been able to answer the questions that I've posed to you in relation to those two paragraphs now adequately?
Mr. Chair, I think we have covered it adequately.
Okay. all right.
Yes, you can put that away. I would like to now deal with the F&B account.
Are we going to back to bundle 5B?
Bundle 5C,
5C.
Chairperson.
I see that we are at 1:45,
Yes, DCJ.
but I guess 15 minutes might still be used profitably.
I'm sure we can
Yeah.
use it, yes.
Yeah, okay, yes. What's the page on the F&B
Page
accounts?
1568.
Okay.
So at 1568, you find an affidavit, a short affidavit from Mr. Benjamin running to 1572. You've had an opportunity to read this affidavit, I take it.
That is correct.
Could I ask you please to go to paragraph 6? This is an affidavit of Mr. Benjamin. He's the head of the Transnet stream investigation team, as you know. At paragraph 6, he says, during November 2018, Fundutsi Forensic Services, Fundutsi, issued a final forensic report commissioned on behalf of National Treasury Style Chapter 3 report relating to Eskom investigations. This report is one of a number of reports issued by Fundutsi in terms of an appointment by National Treasury, then we have the tender number, to conduct forensic investigations into allegations of irregularities and misconduct at Transnet and Eskom. As part of the Commission's ongoing investigations relating to Transnet, I reviewed the above-mentioned Fundutsi Chapter 3 report, specifically paragraphs 8.3, 8.4, and 8.6.7, dealing with an analysis of an FNB bank account with account number 623-649-26380, the account held by Mr. Anoj Singh. Mr. Singh, the former Group Chief Financial Officer of Transnet, in brackets July 2012 to July 2015, and Eskom, in brackets August 2015 to January 2018. I attach here too a copy of an extract of Fundutsi's Chapter 3 report as Annexure CB1, setting out the findings, conclusions, and recommendations of their analysis of the account. I'll refer to the relevant Fundutsi findings later in this affidavit. But perhaps I could take you to this Annexure CB1, if I may. This you find at page 1573. And the relevant part for present purposes, you find at paragraph 8.3, which is on page 1575. And you will see there that there's a heading, Movements in Singh's FNB bank account number. It's the one ending 308 that Mr. Benjamin refers to as the account.
You said 308, you mean 380?
380, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
And Mr. Benjamin refers to that as the account. 8.3.1, during the analysis of Singh's computer hard drive, we determined that there were bank statements for the period 6 July 2012 to 5 July 2016 for FNB account number, the one ending 380 in Singh's name. We further determined that said bank account was opened at FNB Colton Centre on 5 July 2012 with a cash deposit of 200 Rand. We analysed the said statements and established the following. And then they deal with transfers in 2012, transfers in 2013, transfers in 14, transfers in 15, transfers in 16. And then you go to page 1577, there's a heading, the source of credits into Singh's bank account number. It's the one ending 380. They say, from an analysis of Singh's bank account number ending 380, we determined that the description of all the credits as reflected as MAG tape credit TGR01. The credits into Singh's FNB account reflected above include what appears to be his monthly salaries from Transnet and Eskom. Credits further reflected large sums of money whose sources are unknown and suspicious. We determined that the reference ending 136 is reflected in both Singh's ABSA account number and FNB account number, etc. And if I could then take you to the conclusion at page 1579, at paragraph 8.6.8, there's reference there to the fact that Singh indicated in his responses that all funds received in his bank account were received in lieu of his employment at Transnet and or Eskom. And then paragraph 8.6.10, Singh may have received funds from other sources to service his personal lifestyle, as there were minimal transactions in his bank account. Now, can I just ask you to comment on paragraph 8.6.8? My understanding, and from what I've read, is that you were asked to comment on an earlier draft of this report in this regard, in relation to this account. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it seems from paragraph 8.6.8 that the question was asked of you as to what the source of the funds in this account were.
That's correct.
And that your answer was effectively your remuneration from Transnet and or Eskom.
That is correct.
I could take you back then to Mr. Benjamin's affidavit. So at paragraph 7 at page 1569, he's introduced the extract from the Fundutsi report, which we've dealt with, and then at paragraph 8, he says, I was subsequently tasked by the Commission to conduct an independent analysis of the account. Under the heading Procedures Performed, paragraph 9, I established that the Commission had summoned Mr. Singh's bank accounts, including the above-mentioned account during May 2019. Paragraph 10, I was provided access to Mr. Singh's bank statements for the account by the Commission on 26 March 2021. Copies of the bank statements for the account is attached here too as Annexure CB2. And as you would have seen, they run from page 1580 all the way through to page 1712. Would you confirm that?
That is correct, sir.
1580 to 1712.
1712. That is correct. One second.
Then, at paragraph 11, I obtained a spreadsheet of Mr. Singh's net salary payments from the HR department at Transnet for the period August 2010 to November 2015. See Annexure CB3 attached. Now, that attachment you find at page 1713.
You say 1573?
1713.
1713.
You see that, Mr. Singh?
That is correct.
Perhaps you could just keep your finger there and then go back to page 1570 and pick up at paragraph 12. I analysed all the transactions reflected in the account on an Excel spreadsheet from the opening date 5 July 2012 to the closing date 4 December 2016, and he refers to his spreadsheet as CB4. Now that you find at page 1714 through to page 1718. You see that?
That is correct.
Then you can keep your finger there, going back to paragraph 13 at 1570. I compared the deposits made into the account annexure CB4 to the schedule of net remuneration paid by Transnet. I compared my observations based on my independent analysis to the findings in the Untitled Chapter 3 Eskom report. Then under the heading over the page, comparison, independent analysis to findings in Untitled report. 15, I concur with Fundutzi's finding in paragraph 8.6.7 of their report that the bank balance in the account accumulated to 19 million. 16, the balance peaked at 19,884,811 rand and 32 cents in October 2015. Do you agree with that?
Should I have reference to this?
Sorry?
Should I have reference to the documents?
Yep. You go to page 1716 of the spreadsheet. At the bottom, number 41, this is taken from the October statement, and you'll see over the page that the balance reflected in bold
That's good.
is the 19,884,811 rand and 32 cents. See
I'm
that?
sorry, you said page 1716.
So 1716, you go to item number 41, DCJ, at the
Right.
bottom.
Yes, I
That's
see.
dealing with, it's taken from the October 15 statement.
Yes,
And if you go over the page, still dealing with October 15, you will see on the right-hand side in bold, highlighted,
oh yes,
there's the number, the 19 million that we're speaking.
okay.
Would you confirm that, Mr. Singh?
I confirm that.
Then if you go back to paragraph 17 at page 1571, I concur, says Mr. Benjamin, with Fundutzi's finding in paragraph 8.3.20 that Mr. Singh did not utilize his salary for the period July 2012 to July 2015. That's Transnet time. Goes on to say, paragraph 18, and the two paragraphs should be read together, the total debits during the aforementioned period, that's July 2012 to July 2015, amounted to 594,596 rand, of which 450,000 was a transfer to an ABSA account, and the remaining 144,596 rand related to cash withdrawals and point of sales transactions over the 37-month period. Are you in a position to confirm that, or would you need to look at the documents more?
I think for now we'll take it on face value and agree.
Paragraph 19. In paragraph 20.4.2, Fundutsi states that the credits into the account included what appears to be monthly salaries from Transnet and Eskom. Paragraph 20, this is incorrect. The credits relate only to Mr. Singh's remuneration payments from Transnet. Would you confirm that?
That is good.
Paragraph 21. In para 8.4.2, Fundutsi states that the credits further reflected large sums of money whose sources are unknown and suspicious. Paragraph 22, Mr. Benjamin says, this is incorrect. There are no suspicious credits into the account. All deposits relate to remuneration received from Transnet. I take it you would confirm that.
Correct.
And then the last paragraph, which brings us to the stroke of lunchtime, coincidentally, paragraph 23. I note that despite the accumulated amount of 19 million, etc., Mr. Singh did not earn any interest on the account. Would you confirm that?
I will take it at face value at this stage, sir.
Chairperson, it is now 1 o'clock, if this is a convenient time.
Yes, let's take the lunch adjournment and we'll resume at 2. We adjourn.